Hey, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the Just-in-Time Cafe. I am Elizabeth Swan, co-founder of the Just-in-Time Cafe, and I will be your moderator today. If you've never been to the cafe before, you are in for a treat. I'm very excited about today's interactive session, Standard Work Defining the Missing Link, presented by Raaghavan Venkatram. And let me tell you a little bit about Raaghavan. He is a continuous improvement practitioner with Norton McMurray Manufacturing Company, and he started his TWI, Training Within Industry journey, in 2015. Raaghavan is also the chair of the program development team of the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, otherwise known as AME in the Midwest. And he enjoys connecting with other improvement practitioners to share, like all of you, and discuss and learn about applications of concepts that will strengthen his skill set in pursuing personal and business challenges. And he firmly believes that virtue is not in knowing, but in doing. So we will pull Raaghavan in shortly, but just a few housekeeping notes before we get rolling. You can ask questions anytime by putting them into the chat area. There's also a question area. We generally use chat throughout the session. This is an interactive session, unlike our webinars, so we welcome you to share your video, but please stay on mute until Raaghavan asks for input. And this session will be available. We are recording, and it'll be up on the Just-in-Time website, just like other sessions, by the Monday after this session. Please join us for our first activity by sharing where you are from. So you guys register usually from all over the world. We like to find out how international we are. And just where you guys are right now. So if you can type in the chat area where you're joining us from today, that would be great. And let's take a look at who's here. Oh my God, this is awesome. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll be talking about your session momentarily, Jennifer. We got Dan in LA, we got Enos in Portland, Diem in Boise, Idaho, Dimple in Austin, Texas. Way to go. Esther in Seattle. Lenny in San Diego. Welcome, Lenny. We've got Jim in Lincoln, Alan in Connecticut, my neck of the woods, East Coast. Yeah, there's so many West Coast lean people. We got to stand strong on the East Coast. We've got Tiffany, Santa Clara. We've got Gina, Southern California. Karen, New Jersey. Yeah, New Jersey, Karen. Julia, Montreal. Hey, we are officially international. Regina, I'm thinking that's maybe Saskatchewan. We've got, yep, Canada. And then we've got Nipomo, Katie in Nipomo, Central Coast. All right. Margaret in San Fran, Stephen in Olympia. Welcome, Stephen. Raaghavan. Yeah, you're in Chicago. You're representing. And Farah, welcome from San Diego. And Linda, Grand Rapids. Awesome. You guys are representing. So let me move to just give you some upcoming information about the Just-in-Time Cafe. Next month's webinar, and if I can get the next slide, we can go to the next slide. Let's see. There we go. So next up, we have a webinar called The Ninth Invisible Waste, How You Show Up Matters, with Jennifer Ayers. And, you know, the number one waste in the workplace can be drama, right? Drama is considered emotional waste and can consume up to 2 hours of your workday. Taking responsibility for how we show up and holding ourselves and others accountable in relationships impacts performance, improvement, and how we navigate disruption and change. So join this 1 hour webinar or interactive session to learn techniques designed to help us reflect on how we are showing up from Jennifer Ayers. She is the executive director of Northwest High Performance Enterprise Consortium, and she's honed a path for lean practitioners to make a positive impact on the people and processes around us by striving to eliminate drama. So I'll put a link into the chat so you guys can register if you want. And then let's tell you about the latest podcast that's out. And this one is an interview with Rebecca Snelling. And she is a board member of the Lean Construction Institute. And she has seen what makes the lean path work in the building industry. We also include a review of an app that provides an antidote to corporate silos. And on the same topic, we asked our problem-solving community, what have you seen that helps break down organizational silos? So you get some awesome crowdsourced countermeasures at the cafe. So by registering for this interactive session, you guys are going to be on our mailing list, which you can absolutely opt out. No worries. We're not going to haunt you, but we just will tell you all about the upcoming free webinars and interactive sessions that are awesome, like this one. And with that, let me bring our guest host today is Raaghavan. Raaghavan, come on.
Okay, I see some familiar faces here. I do not know if that's supposed to make me feel comfortable or nervous. It's a mix of both. Okay. So thank you for signing up for this webinar and choosing to spend your time listening to work standards, defining the missing lean link. Now, before we begin, just a little heads up. Through this interactive session, you may not hear anything that is groundbreaking. Standard work is not groundbreaking stuff, right? It is Lean 101. Any Lean course you sign up for, standard work is probably going to be chapter 1. But oftentimes it is a struggle to get standard work to get us the intended result. It's always good to go back to the basics. So this is not rocket science, but much needed science, if you will. Okay, and I want to start off with my favorite quote. Virtue is not knowing, but doing. And I think this quote can set the tone for the discussion on standard work that is to follow. But before we go there, I would like to get a sense for how experienced or how much of an expert you think you are with standard work. So on a scale of 1 to 5, right? With 5 being, I'm an expert in standard work, and 1 being, I'm just getting started, where would you rate yourself? Please type that in the chat box, please. So a lot of 3s and 4s, no experts. It's good, always good. Okay, so now let's jump on to the results you're getting from standard work. Okay, with 1 being, standard work, I'm having a hard time trying to get standard work to drive continuous improvement. And 5 being, oh yeah, standard work is driving continuous improvement at my workplace every single day. Where would you rate that? A lot of 1s and a lot of 2s. Boy, did I see a drop on that one. Okay. So this is the disconnect that I'm talking about. We are going to be discussing about. And knowing is one thing, and actually doing it is a totally different thing. And that's so true when it comes to standard work, because I think as lean thinkers, we are very strong with the fundamentals of standard work, of what it should look like, what it's supposed to do. But when it comes to driving actionable results every single day using standard work, we are not so good. So that is what we'll be discussing today. And hopefully this missing link will help you solve that puzzle and get better at using standard work to drive continuous improvement. Okay, so let's start with the very basic stuff. This House of Lean, I'm pretty sure you've seen it, and the base of which is stability, and then standard work is the foundation of the House of Lean, right? So let's define standard work. I bet you've seen this definition. Standard work is the current best way we know how to perform a process. The key word here is the current best way. Points out the ever-evolving nature of standard work. Standard work is not something that is set in stone. It is and should be constantly evolving. And on that note, I borrowed this quote from the Kata community. I'm not sure where they got theirs from, but I borrowed it. With standard work, you are doing it wrong if you're not doing it the same in 3 months. And you're doing it wrong if you are doing it the same in 3 months. You see that nature of standard work is supposed to be flexible. It is supposed to be ever evolving, supposed to be changing. But what is the purpose of standard work? Why even have it in the first place? Well, the purpose is to help see problems as a gap. And a problem is a gap between what is expected and what is actually happening. And when you set the what's expected part, that's where standard work comes into place. I've heard terms like baseline, used often, but somehow I think it does not emphasize the ever-evolving nature of standard work. And I like the current best way better as a way of defining standard work. Okay, so Taichi Ono has said that without standard work, there's no continuous improvement or Kaizen. They are two sides of the same coin, right? And the whole purpose of standard work is to drive continuous improvement, which is what we lean thinkers are going after at our workplaces every single day. So this model you see here that we call, I work at Normac, and this model is used within our company. It's called the See, Solve, and Strengthen model of continuous improvement. I think this model gives a neat picture of what continuous improvement should look like and what role standard work plays in it. So in any company, in any workplace, in any sector, you have someone who's leading, operations. Call them the supervisor or the frontline leader. They have a job, and then there's people who are actually doing the work, and they are called the operators. So what's the role of a frontline leader or the supervisor? Their role is to see, solve, and strengthen. So what does it mean to see? You are able to see problems or opportunities in your workplace every single day. It's not just enough that you see them. You got to take the initiative to solve them. And it's not just enough that you solve them, because we know things can slide back real quickly. So you have to strengthen these systems so whatever you solved or the gains you made are actually sustained. So that is the See, Solve, Strengthen model of continuous improvement. And this model pulls in the J programs as necessary in the solve and strengthen phases, but we're not going to dive too deep into that. But in the C phase, when you're able to see problems or opportunities for improvement, that's where standard work and work standards come into play. So what is then the role of an operator? Well, I would argue that the role of an operator is even more important than the role of the frontline leader, because it is the operator who's going to be following the standard work rigorously, stop when standard work cannot be followed, escalate the problem to the process owner, and then work with the process owner / frontline leader / supervisor to strengthen the system and sustain the gains from the problem solving itself. Okay, so just like with any lean concept, be it improvement kata, be it training within industry, or any lean methodology for that instance, we always look at the results. We always look at the toolkit, and we try to copy the tools, right? So every time I do a webinar, people are like, "Oh, that was a good webinar. And by the way, can I get that template that you shared towards the end?" The templates are tempting, yes, and I'm guilty of that myself. But the core of lean doesn't lie in templates; it lies in scientific thinking itself. And I think that is what a lot of us lean thinkers and companies in general miss out on. We look at the results and we think the tools get us the results, but I don't think that is the case. Well, the people who wrote Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System and Mike Rother, who did Improvement Kata, they also have found that that is not the case. There is an underlying scientific thinking pattern that is deeply rooted within the context of the Toyota Production System. And at Toyota, every standard work is a hypothesis that is tested through action. So that is something I think we got to keep at the front and center of our understanding about standard work itself. Okay, so here is a paradox. At Toyota, you would have read about pitch marks on the floor that are made to the tenths of a second that indicate where an operation should happen at specific points in time. Every operation is defined in such details as, in a matter of seconds, the exact number of steps an operator should take, everything is defined so precisely. And at the beginning, we said, standard work is flexible. We said it's not set in stone. And yet the way things are specified might give an impression that it is set in stone, right? So let's think about this. What comes to your mind when you think of the word control? When you hear the word control, you think about rigid, unchanging, not flexible, right? But when you think of the word experiment, you think about, the tendency to fail, the tendency to improve, flexibility, right? Now put those two words together: controlled, rigid, experiment, flexible. A controlled experiment. That is what standard work is. And why do you think that controlled experiment is necessary? Without a controlled experiments, if you know about PDCA thinking, it is going to be hard to establish a cause and effect relationship. You do not know which change caused what effect. And without understanding cause and effect relationship, you would not be able to perform hypothesis testing, which is the core of scientific thinking. So, as Steven Spear points out in his article, Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System, the rigid specification is the very thing that makes the flexibility and creativity possible at Toyota. I think most of us lean practitioners, or at least industrial engineers, we take the controlled part and we think it's set in stone. We completely forget the experiment part of the standard work. And on that note, I would like to share what I call the bolt story, a story that is often shared by Mark Rosenthal, a highly respected thinker within the TWI Kata and the lean community. So apparently there was this assembly line in Toyota where they had pitch marks on the floor and the work was progressing smoothly. And it so happened that there was a certain operator who was fumbling with a certain bolt. He could not get a specific bolt into a specific location of the car he was assembling. So he was fumbling with it. He dropped the bolt and the car moves past the pitch line. He's lagging behind. So he pulls the hand-on card, it sounds a signal, and then the supervisor is right there. And what do you think the first thing is that the supervisor does? He reaches for the exact same bolt. He does the assembly and he keeps the line moving. I have a question for you. So there was a box of bolts right there where the operator was. But why did the supervisor go for that exact bolt that the operator dropped? Please type it in the chat box. Or you can actually speak up. You can unmute and go for that if that's okay. Liz, why do you think the supervisor did what he did?
Yeah, feel free to chime in, anybody.
Not waste the bolt. Okay. He wanted to experience it for himself. Okay. Yeah. So I think what the supervisor, to check the quality of the bolt, eliminate variation in quantity. Okay, quality, I think is what you're meaning. Okay, so what the supervisor was trying to do within split seconds was trying to ascertain whether it was man, material, or machine that was causing the problem. What about that exact bolt was causing the problem? And he was reacting that way because he had scientific thinking deeply ingrained in his mind. Now remember, this happened in split seconds. So when he found out that he could install the bolt, he could carefully rule out that it was not material that was causing the operator to fumble. It was probably something along the lines of training or something like that, which I'm pretty sure he would have got to the root cause of it. But the core still remains that he went after the bolt to test a hypothesis. And that is what we often miss in our line of work when we work with standard work. Okay, me going back and forth, losing connection, tensions running high. So let's cool it down a little bit. Let's call Mr. Chaplin to the rescue. I'm glad I had him in my presentation. So let's go through this video. Hopefully the audio comes through, but if it does not, it's supposed to be a silent movie, so you'll still get the point. Let's go for it. Okay, so do you think Mr. Chaplin was following standard work in this case? Type it in the chat box where you can speak up. What's the fun in that, right? He was not. And so what are some of the elements you were looking at to gauge whether or not standard work was being followed? He was trying, I agree, Tony. He was trying real hard, probably. So there are some elements you're looking at. It's very visual in this case, and he's a very visual person. So the line's moving, and he's lagging behind. The parts have reached the next operation, still incomplete. The downstream customer is yelling at him, not to mention the foreman or the supervisor who's also yelling at him. So people wouldn't be yelled at if they were following standard work, would they? So standard work is not being followed, and these are the elements you're looking at, right? And is there an underlying hypothesis? What if I told you there is? Let's look at what it is. So here is what you were testing when you were looking at that video, when that foreman yelled at Chaplin, when that downstream customer, yelled at, the operator. This is what they were testing, even though they did not realize it. The hypothesis is that the person or machine can do the activity as specified. Can the person or machine do the activity as specified? The problem symptom is the activity is not done as specified, as in this case. And the response is you determine the true skill level of the person or the true capability of the machine or the process and train or modify as appropriate. Now, this has been adapted from Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System. So in order to test this hypothesis, you would need these three elements of standard work. You would need to know the content, what needs to be done, right? That's the work itself. Number two, you would need to know the sequence, in what order should these tasks be done. Number three, you should know the timing, in how much time should each step and hence the entire task be completed. Whether you know it or not, you are running this hypothesis every single time you are observing someone operate a certain process. We don't even know it most of the times. And the tools in our standard work toolbox help test this hypothesis. And I'm an industrial engineer myself, and I love my standard work toolbox. The toolbox that has the time observation sheets, the standard work combination sheet, and a standard work chart. I love it, right? And you know what I think a industrial engineer's best friend is? It's this guy, this stopwatch. That's the industrial engineer's best friend. You just create a bunch of standard work, and then when it's time for a standard work audit, go stand in front of an operator, click this guy on, and then decide whether or not the operator is doing a good job. Along that note, I would like to share a personal story. This was when I was working for a company in Houston. I had just got out of A&M with a master's degree in industrial engineering, and this company was all about time and motion studies. So I was asked to do a time and motion study, which is what industrial engineers love. So I did that, right? And I was setting expectations for content sequence and timing. And we had production boards set up in each workstation, and the numbers were written every hour, and work was progressing. And one day I noticed an operator was actually stashing a certain set of parts very secretively behind his desk. So I approached him and I said, like, what's going on here? Are these parts not supposed to be passed on to the downstream process? And he's like, yeah, I made 5 more pieces this hour. I'm saving those, so in case I lag behind in the next hour, I can make up for that on the production board. So he was hiding away these pieces, so when he would fall behind, he could use them to not look bad. So back then, what I was most concerned about was this. Oh, as an industrial engineer, I had failed to identify the most parts that could come out of this process, because obviously he could make 5 more than what I had defined, right? So that was what I was concerned about. I was like, what did I miss? Which of the concepts that I learned did I not apply here? How could he make 5 more, and how did I miss that, right? But now, 10 years later, after I've known, or I think I know, some more stuff about standard work, here's what bugs me. Back then, I took away from him an opportunity to approach standard work as an experiment. The guy had a way of operating the process more efficiently, but he was more scared of the timing aspect of the standard work that he did not come forward to share his best practice. Nor did I ask him for the best practice, because back then, in my mind, I was after the numbers. I was trusting this guy more than the operator who was doing the job. So hypothesis number 1 is very essential, yes. And our tools in the standard work toolbox help test this hypothesis, but time isn't the only thing that is of essence with standard work, okay? Now, let's look at another case. So I was going online and I found this video of standard work not being followed, which I think is hilarious. I tried to do the same thing with standard work being followed. A, I had a hard time trying to find a video, and B, when I found one, it was not funny. What's the fun when you find a worker following standard work, right? So I just pieced some stuff together, and I think that should still, get us somewhere. So imagine this situation, where workers are in an assembly line. They get the raw material, it's passing through 3 operators, and then it's ending into finished goods, right? This company has a hour-by-hour board where expectations are set by the hour, just like this guy did, and then the operator marks out how much they actually did every hour, and then they record the gap and the reason for the gaps, right? So how are they doing? If you were someone who was passing by this workstation and you saw this daily production report, what would you think? How are they doing? How are they doing? Are they doing good? No? You can, when I ask a question, you can either type it in the chat box, or you can just unmute and go for it. Okay, some hours overproduced to plan. Okay. In the bigger scheme of things, if someone were to ask you, is this team winning or losing, what would you tell them? Are they winning? Yeah. Okay. Good. Oh, good question, Katie. All right. I give you one half of the story. What if I told you this was the other half of the story that I forgot to mention? Oh, by the way, 1 in 5 pieces that they were making every hour is also defective. How about now? Are they still doing a good job? Well, the numbers said so, right? So is there a hypothesis we failed to test? What did we fail to test here in this case? Quality? Okay. So there's defects. So obviously quality was missed. But if you were to put this in terms of a hypothesis, what did we fail to test? So this is the hypothesis we do not test most times until triggered by a corrective action request or an end-of-line inspection. Then they find out, oh my God, there's a lot of defects here. Until that happens, we never ever test this hypothesis. That brings us to hypothesis number 2. If the activity is done as specified, then the good or the service will be defect-free. A problem symptom is a defect, and the response would be to modify the design activity. So in order to test this hypothesis, you would need defining outcome. What does good look like? Well, you might say, well, that's not rocket science. But I told you in the very beginning, it is not rocket science, right? So why is it a big deal defining outcome? Don't we define outcomes every day? Don't we know what good looks like? Yes and no. Find that in most cases, our definition of good is highly subjective. You know, 2 people might be looking at a certain product or a service, and one person might think that it is good, and another person might think it's not. So when you don't have clear expectations of what good or normal looks like, then your definition of not good is also subjective and depends on who, what, and when things are being looked at. And now go back to the initial slide when we said a problem is a gap between what's expected and what's supposed to happen. Well, if you don't have clear expectation of what good is, then you don't have a clear problem statement. You might do one of 2 things. You might over-process the problem. You might solve it and get it way beyond what good actually is supposed to be, or you might underperform, where you might have a very vague understanding of what the problem is. You might slap some things in and think that the problem has been solved, but in reality, it's much lesser than what good actually is. So without a definition of what good is, it's hard to solve problems. And that's this hypothesis, because you have to have binary tests built in that will tell the operator if he or she is doing not just a good job, but if the outcome is defect-free. If you do have a clear expectation of what normal looks like, then your definition of abnormal, or the gap, is also objective and the same no matter who, what, and when things are being looked at. And that comes from my friend, Oscar Roche, who actually introduced me to this concept of defining work standards. And defining work standards will help us test this hypothesis that we often fail to test. And that, I think, is the missing piece of the lean puzzle. We are so much after the content, the sequence, and the timing of the job, but we do not define these outcomes well enough, and we are not able to test standard work as a hypothesis. What's missing? Well, all or most of our standardized work efforts are focused on the pace of work. Little or no effort towards defining work standards to check the outcome of the work itself, and both are critical to an effective system of standard work. Okay, so what does that mean? So, Mr. Oscar Roche, he is with the TWI Institute of Australia. And when he introduced me to work standards, he had learned these concepts from Mr. Isao Kato. So with work standards, what you do is you start with the customer. You start defining what work standards are for the product. Whatever product or service it is, that is your output. What is good from the perspective of the customer? Now, once you've identified that, you go upstream and decide, okay, now what is good for the machine or the process that produces that output? And once that has been established, then define what's good for the operation or the people who are doing the actual work. Now, what we tend to do is we tend to start here. We tend to start with operations for people. Remember that toolkit that I was talking to you about? Those process study sheets? You take that process study sheet, and what do? We walk right up to the operator, and we start breaking down work elements, lowest repeatable times, exit cycle times, takt times, stuff like that. That's where our standard work efforts start and unfortunately also end. You don't have this part. So if you do not have this part, you cannot test standard work as a hypothesis anymore. What does that mean? Let me explain. So the hypothesis we want to test based on this article by Steven Spear and H. Kent Brown, Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System, is if people follow a normal operation, then the machine or process would operate normally. A normally operating machine or process would then produce a good or normal product or output. Now, if you don't have either of these, then there's no way you can test the first hypothesis. If person A does the activity as specified, then the outcome would be defect-free. You can't test that because you haven't defined work standards for the machine or the process. So Mr. Kato has hammered the following point for many years. Before you can begin with standardized work, you must clarify work standards. And the primary function of a work standard is to define normal. And remember, normal means an objective definition of what is good and what is bad, no matter who, what, and when things are being looked at, okay? On a bigger scale, it would look something like this. Calls this the flow of normal. So you start by defining normal or good from the customer's point of view. Then you go ahead and define normal for the machine that's producing the product. Then you go ahead and define normal for the sequence of operation that a person is supposed to perform. Once you've done that, now you can test the hypothesis that I mentioned before. The hypothesis flows this way, but the definition of normal actually starts the other way around. So when I talk about work standards, these are not to be confused with, those big volumes of books that are collecting dust in some corner of your building and are pulled out once in a while when there's an, ISO audit or a quality audit of some sort. That is not what we are going after here. These are work standards that are created by the operators doing the work, as you see here on the right. That is a very simple and yet clear definition of what good looks like. Do not confuse them with the standard operating procedures or the policies that are very essential for the organization, yes, but they are of little to no use with the day-to-day operations that happen within the shop floor. Okay, so the work standards that we're talking about should look like this. And this is an example of what we use here at Normac. So we make, products like these. These are little nuts that go in a compression fitting. So when someone makes a nut like this, that person needs to know what good looks like, right? So this is our attempt at defining what good looks like. We started by defining what good looks like for the end product based on customer needs. So after we do that, we would go ahead and start defining normal for the machine that produces this product. And once we have that, then we would go ahead and define normal for the operations that the operator would follow to set up that machine. So if we have, let's say, a defective part, the first question that gets asked is how we checked the setup conditions on the machine. There is the scientific thinking. Once you ask that question, there is scientific thinking. But if you go ahead, jump the process of the machine and go over to the operator and yell at them for not following standard work and producing a bad outcome, then the hypothesis testing or the scientific thinking mindset is clearly missing. So before I knew about work standards, I thought I knew everything about standard work. I mean, I was brought into Normac primarily in 2015 to establish, standard work systems for different processes. And I thought I was doing great because, I was doing everything that we should be doing, because I was not creating the standard work from a cubicle. I was having the operators do it. I was training them to do it. It was being created at the Gemba by the people doing the actual work. And still, the outcome was almost the same as if I would have created it. We were still going after time. We were still not using standard work as a hypothesis. And the scientific thinking piece of standard work was completely missing. But when I had this coaching session with Oscar, and he introduced me to this concept of defining work standards, that was eye-opening for me. Now, suddenly, the article by Steven Spear made a lot of sense to me. I had read it before, but I had just brushed it aside, saying, this is too simple. I do it already, right? That's what we often do with simple things. We take them for granted. We think we already know them. But I'm often surprised at the number of times that our threshold of knowledge is with a very simple and easily understandable process such as standard work itself, right? So the work standards we're talking about here are not to be confused with standard operating procedures. They should be simple and yet a clear definition of what good looks like, and should be simple enough to be useful for day-to-day operations, hypothesis testing, and improvement at the Gemba. So in summary, all work should be specified in terms of content, sequence, timing, and outcome. But we should start defining the outcome first, which is what defining work standards is all about, before jumping into the content, sequence, and timing, for which there are tools already available in our toolbox. And it is not just time that is of the essence with standard work. I mean, I've learned not to just treat standard work as something to gauge another person's work against just using time as a metric. It extends, there's something more than just time when it comes to standard work. Then standard work is an end condition after work standards have properly been identified. So when you see standard work as the foundation of that house of lean, we jump in and we're like, oh my God, I don't have standard work. So that's why all my lean initiatives are failing. So I have to go and create standard work, right? And that's what we did. That's what a lot of companies do, right? But yes and no. So you have to, the intent is good that you should have standard work in place, but before having standard work in place, you should have work standards properly identified. People should have been trained on those work standards and they should be following it. And then the next step up would be standardized work. So that to me was the missing piece. Now, hopefully some of what I said resonated with you. Maybe yes, maybe not. And I would like to hear from you, either way. So I know we still have about 15 minutes. Is that right, Liz? 20 minutes?
Yes, we do. We have time.
Okay, we have time. So, yeah, that brings me to the end of the presentation, but we do have time for questions, answers, feedback. Which part of it do you tend to agree with, or the part that you're in disagreement with? Let's discuss any of those. And sorry about that technical glitch that took away a good 7 minutes.
Good recovery, Raghavan. Good recovery. One thing that's popped up that Tony's offering up, and wondering if you knew that there's an app that Gemba Docs that allows easy mobile phone-based standard work. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
So it's an app that produces.
Tony, do you want to describe it?
Yeah, I saw it on a webinar that AME put on to the 2-second lean series. And it is an app that's on your phone that allows you to make standard work with pictures and narration. Also creates Kanban cards. So there's a free 30-day trial, and it's made by one of our own companies. I don't, I'm not involved in any way. I just think it's a good thing. I made my morning standard work using it, and it was very helpful to me.
Sounds interesting. Interesting.
But to your points, Raaghavan, it's really been helpful for just teasing out standard work, versus work standards. I don't think I've ever had that put quite so nicely. And the distinction is incredibly helpful. Yeah, you got people agreeing. I mean, it's very, I think we're trained to think of it as, sequence and content.
Yeah, and we always go after just the pace of work. I mean, our brains are so trained to do that, right? And everything we have to measure performances in one way or the other, going after time. If you have your production boards, we are playing the green versus red game all along, when red means something's bad and green means, oh, everything's good. That may not always be the case. If we start treating red as being bad, then you easily run the risk of the situation that I mentioned in my previous job, where the operators tashed a few parts. This was a well-intentioned operator, but fear took over scientific thinking, and that's what happened. So we can kill good intentions with bad tools.
That was a great story. Really looking back and realizing, oh, he had a technique I wish I would have explored.
One of the things that we deal with, Raaghavan, where I work, is we have a very high turnover rate. People today, the way the businesses are operating, and it's very difficult to, we spend an awful lot of time on, creating training for people, and having to repeat as often as we do. It can be exhausting, and so we try to keep it as simple as we can, like Tony was suggesting, having pictures and documents that people can follow more easily without having, an intense training. But it's still, it's very tiring sometimes when the operator turnover is as great as it is. We've got new people coming in all the time. But I appreciate, your presentation today. It's been helpful to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Good to see you.
You too.
And Raaghavan, you've got a question from Stephen Thompson.
Steve.
Hi. So this is a great presentation, and it really kind of clarified something for me. So a lot of the people that I work with are, how can I put this, in small volume craft production. They're knowledge workers, right? And there's this, I have often, I don't push standard work that hard because it tends to be a really non-productive conversation, right? And in some ways what you've done is you've helped explain why that is, right? Because in knowledge work, when you're part of the challenge is that the definition of quality for each individual product is, it's not subjective, but you are relying on that knowledge worker to know what quality in that case actually is. And so it becomes very difficult to sort of define for that product or for what that person is producing, which then gets me back to kind of standard work. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, on how you would think about work standards and standard work for knowledge work and for work where the definition of quality is really something that the worker has to determine in each individual case.
I haven't run into such situations, if I'm honest, because, what we do is, products that have very clear specifications. I can see how it can be a challenge for you. But I'm tempted to say that it is still possible to define outcome. It's not fair to the operator that he's assigned a certain task, he or she is assigned a certain task. But then we keep saying, oh, by the way, the outcome is vague. So if you have instances when, in 99.9% of the times you might be doing fine, but those 0.1% of the time when the customer, returns a reject, do you ever go back to the operator and tell them, didn't you know that this is what you're supposed to look at? If you do, then that's not fair to the operator. You should now start pushing for outcomes to be defined a little bit better. You're not going to get it perfect on the first go. I know that because when we started defining normal for even products with a blueprint, there was, a lot of emotions that ran within the quality department. They were like, why should we do this? We haven't done this in so many years. What's the point, right? So it was hard to start. And I was almost ready to give up myself. But when you keep pushing and when people actually see that there is something that they're looking for, and that something is translatable into actual metrics or clear illustrations, then it can work wonders. So my suggestion is give it a shot, give it a push. Start with one feature of that part that you're making and see where it takes you.
That's great comments, because it's the lack of standards really leads to oftentimes a lot of overprocessing, right? If I'm in charge of my own standards and my job is to not fail, I'm going to gold plate everything, right? I'm going to drive to beyond what is actually required, but I can. It's a gateway to perfectionism instead of really being aware of what are specific failures and can we name those specific failures and make sure that we don't avoid them, or that we avoid them. So great, thank you very much.
Really appreciate that conversation. I feel like I'm right in between kind of, where your bolts are, Raghav, and Stephen, where you're at in terms of like kind of a unique situation. I'm looking at HR and recruitment. And so I think we can define some work standards, but there might be different levels or different standards, and some trade-offs to be made for each position or something. So I think probably somewhere in the middle of that spectrum is kind of where I fall. So it's really good to kind of hear you guys talk that out and see your perspective and all that. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I have a new favorite phrase: gateway to perfectionism.
So along that line of perfectionism, so when we don't define what normal or good is in an objective manner, what tends to happen is, people start seeing exceptions, right? And then at some point of time, the exception becomes the norm. Now your exception becomes the new standard work, right? And then it's this telephone game, and over the course of many months or weeks or years, you're going to have this so-called standard work that's completely different from what it was originally intended to be. But at the same time, you also have this challenge that you cannot solve every single problem that comes up every single day, because sometimes they are just not the most cost-effective. Like in some cases, you can't get to the definition of good that you established, but it is at least worthwhile for people to understand that they are running an exception. Normal, the perfection is what we are going after. Yes, that's been set in green, but we are running on red is the term that Oscar uses. So you know that we're not where we are supposed to be at, and it's an exception. We are going with it only because it's not cost effective enough to get to that perfect point. You don't have to do it all at once, but having that clear definition of good right there helps you see that this is an exception. This is not the norm. Someday you will get to that perfection point.
Nice.
Thank you. And yes, at HR, that we work with people doing hiring and recruiting and onboarding all the time. They're like, we can't codify that. I'm like, let's talk about that. Not going to be perfect, but we can get closer.
Definitely.
Yeah, so I'll chime in real quick. So my focus is on HR essentially. So all practices, onboarding, offboarding, and essentially I think you can quantify what you're doing, right, by your SLAs, by mapping things out, doing those check-ins, check-outs. Hey, is this currently working? Is this not working? I work for a company right now, like essentially we are always constantly improving our processes. Like it's a day in and day out, right? We implement something, we go back and we check, hey, with our users, did this work what we initially thought? You know, what's not working? And so it's that constant rhythm. So we kind of go over the mindset that it's about progress, not perfection, that we're in this learning journey, which leans about that constant learning discovery that we're doing. And it's just, you know, constantly listening to your users, what's happening, what's not happening, but having your SLAs in place. That's what's important, especially when you're in something like HR. So like, what's your time to fill? What, you know, how long should this task take to process? Like from the time you get it to like that end result back to your user essentially, or your customer. So those are really some key things to be thinking about, especially if we're not in the manufacturing setting, right? We're in a different setting, in that office setting, which we're seeing really be involved in now, taking that next level. And so I think that's, you know, really important, is looking at like, what is your product? What is the output? And based on that output, you kind of work a little bit backwards to determining what it should look like, how long this should take, what are our wastes, you know, that we can get rid of, exactly like our standard works. And so it's just working through those things and then constantly fine tuning. If you're expecting perfection straight out the gate, it's not going to happen. Like you got to keep working on it day in and day out.
Yep. Totally agree with that. Thank you, Tiffany.
Yeah. Thanks, Tiffany. That's a huge point, because I'm actually working right now with a company trying to streamline onboarding. And yeah, and just the incidence of ghosting, right? With
Yep.
the Great Resignation. So if your processes are slow, if you're not good at making the credentialing, provisioning, all that happen in a reasonable amount of time, another job's going to come up and you're just not even going to know they've exited the building. So it's, and you're just bringing up a really good point that what is the standard, right? For coming up with a solid start date? What is the standard for time to ship the PC? And, you know, how easy it should be for them to unbox and set it up. So all these things coming out, non-manufacturing, but so in need of not just the standard work, but the work standards.
Yeah. Like I will say, so I work for ServiceNow. So we're the company that, you know, is all about processing and streamlining and that kind of stuff. And so we do have an onboarding tool that we do utilize, but even with that onboarding tool, we still have to function that once we post to hire, what does that look like? What are our expectations? And then from there, our onboarding tool takes you into that. How soon am I going to get my computer? What type of computer? Rolling into all of that information. And I'll say my teammates on here too, Olga. And so she's very familiar, you know, working in tech and us doing that HR perspective of what those things look like in that business setting. And when we're working with, new tools that are coming out for our platforms.
That's great. That's great. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yep.
Other questions, observations? Well, we have the mind of Raaghavan. And you've got a thumbs up from Sam Morgan.
Hey, Sam, good to see you.
Thanks, Raaghavan. Appreciate it. Good stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been able to see the chat at all, but you're getting a lot of folks that had to get to another meeting but so appreciated this presentation and what you brought to light.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed presenting, and once again, sorry about the technical glitch. But I really enjoyed the questions, the insights, the feedback, and all of that. But I would continue to learn how your journey is going. I would like to learn to hear from you. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me there, please do. I go by Raaghavan Venkatram, and that's my email. You can also reach out to me through email, and I would like to hear about how your standard work journey is going. So yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you so much, Raaghavan, and thanks everybody for sticking it out through our glitch, and just wonderful presentation, Raaghavan. So great to have you. I'm so glad you were game to come to the cafe.
Thank you, Liz. I totally enjoyed it. It was fun.
Bye, guys.